All right, buckle up, everyone, because today we are diving into some seriously choppy waters.
Oh, I like that. Choppy waters indeed.
Yeah, well, the U.S. has just made a move that has the potential to completely change the game in the war in Ukraine.
Definitely a big development.
They decided to go ahead and enter into direct negotiations with Russia to try and bring the conflict to an end.
Interesting.
And on the surface, you might think, okay, that sounds promising, right? Like it's a step towards peace.
Sure.
But here's the thing.
Yeah.
Both Ukraine and the European Union, they've been totally left out of these discussions.
I see.
So that's what we're going to unpack today. What does this unexpected move mean for the future of the war? What does it mean for Europe's security and for those oh-so-important transatlantic relations?
Well, it really is a fascinating situation, isn't it? I mean, this goes way beyond just diplomatic protocol. This move has triggered a real wave of concern and uncertainty across Europe.
I bet. You know, it's a bit like, let's say you're trying to negotiate peace between two feuding neighbors,
Yeah,
right?
right.
But you decide to do it without actually talking to either of them.
Yeah, not exactly a recipe for success.
Not really. But before we get to those reactions, can you maybe help us understand what might be driving this American pivot toward these direct talks with Russia? I mean, hasn't the U.S. been Ukraine's biggest supporter this whole time?
Oh, absolutely. Since the war began, the U.S. has been the main source of military and economic aid to Ukraine. They've really stepped up. But there are a few factors, that might be pushing the White House towards this new approach.
Well,
First, you have to think about the money. The financial burden of supporting Ukraine is just enormous. And there's a growing awareness in Washington of just how much this is costing in the long term, economically.
right. Some of you have got sticker shock setting in.
Yeah, exactly. And then, and you can't forget this either, you've got to factor in the domestic political landscape here. Public support for the war, it might be waning a bit. And with elections coming up, you know how it is. The administration could be feeling the pressure to find a resolution, and to find one sooner rather than later.
Makes sense. But wouldn't this kind of sidelining of their allies, especially ones that have been so actively involved, wouldn't that cause a major rift?
It definitely has the potential to, and we're already seeing some very strong reactions, particularly from Germany. I mean, Boris Pistorius, the German defense minister, he was pretty blunt in his assessment. He straight up said that it's regrettable that concessions are already being made before Ukraine even gets a seat at the table.
Wow, regrettable. It sounds like there's a real sense of betrayal there. What are they so worried about?
Well, that quote, it really reflects a broader fear in Europe that in this rush to reach a settlement that benefits, the U.S. and Russia, that Ukraine's interests are going to be sacrificed. I mean, Germany and the EU, they've put so much into supporting Ukraine. Financially, militarily, and let's not forget, through sanctions against Russia. They see this exclusion as a sign that their role, and frankly, the sacrifices they've made, are just being disregarded.
It's like, and I'm going to use a sports analogy here.
Okay.
It's like Germany and the EU, they've been carrying the ball down the field this whole time, and now suddenly the U.S. calls an audible and decides to go for the touchdown all on their own.
That's a great analogy. It really highlights why this has generated so much frustration. It just raises all these questions about the reliability of the U.S. as a partner, especially, when you consider NATO, where collective defense is supposed to be so important. And it's not just Germany that's uneasy either. NATO itself is taking a very cautious stance on all this.
Right. I remember reading something about that. So what's NATO's take?
Well, Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, he emphasized that any negotiation, it needs to lead to a durable and sustainable outcome. And this is where, history starts to come into play. Think back to things like the Munich Agreement or even the Treaty of Versailles. Both of those, they were attempts to create peace, but they ultimately failed. They didn't actually address the root causes of the conflict.
Okay, I see. So you're saying that rushing into a deal just to stop the fighting, that could backfire pretty spectacularly.
Oh, yeah.
If it doesn't deal with those underlying issues.
Exactly. And that's a huge concern, especially for countries that feel directly threatened by Russia, the ones that border Russia or the ones that used to be part of the Soviet bloc. A hastily put together peace deal that gives concessions to Russia, well, that could actually embolden them. It could lead to even more aggression in the future, especially towards nations that are seen as more vulnerable.
So it's not just about ending this war, but it's also about preventing future ones.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that brings us to Poland.
Okay.
Their response has been the most emphatic rejection of this whole U.S.-Russia thing. Donald Tusk, the Polish prime minister, he went on social media and stated very clearly that the only way to achieve a just peace is through, and I quote, a coordinated effort between Ukraine, Europe, and the United States. He even put the word junto, which means together, in all caps, just to drive the point home.
Wow, that's not exactly your typical diplomatic language. He's definitely drawing a line in the sand. But why is Poland reacting so strongly?
Well, their history with Russia is, should I put this, complicated, and honestly quite traumatic.
Right.
For centuries, Poland has been caught in the middle, stuck between these powerful empires, and often ending up as, well, a pawn in their geopolitical games. They've been invaded by Russia multiple times, partitioned, occupied, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, I remember learning about that in history class. But how does that history shape how they see the current situation?
Well, it creates a very deep-seated mistrust of Russia's intentions. They see Ukraine as this buffer state, this vital barrier between Poland and a resurgent Russia. And any weakness, any concession to Russia when it comes to Ukraine, they see that as a direct threat to their own security.
So they see this U.S. move as a betrayal, not just of Ukraine, but of the whole Eastern European region.
Exactly. And that same sentiment is echoed in the Baltic states as well. Hanno Pevkur, the Estonian defense minister, he warned that any deal that's made without Europe being involved will not be lasting.
I see.
This really underscores the fact that the EU isn't just a bystander here. They've been doing a lot. They've been providing military funding, they've been sending humanitarian aid, and they've imposed those significant sanctions on Russia.
So cutting them out of these negotiations is not only disrespectful, but it seems pretty strategically short-sighted.
Absolutely. And we can't forget, Ukraine wants to join the EU. So that makes Brussels a key stakeholder in any peace agreement that's going to impact Ukraine's future. Essentially, what Poland and the Baltic states are saying is, look, if you want a lasting peace, you can't just ignore the reality on the ground in Europe.
Okay, so we've got a pretty clear idea of how Poland and the Baltic states feel. But how is the rest of Europe reacting to this? Are they all as fiercely opposed to the U.S. going it alone?
Well, you see a whole spectrum of responses, which really reflects the different perspectives within the EU. Some countries, like Spain and Italy, they're definitely concerned about the U.S. acting unilaterally, but their reaction hasn't been quite as assertive as, well, let's say, fiery as Poland and the Baltic states.
Okay, so a bit less fiery, but still cautious. Why the difference?
It's probably a combination of things. Geography definitely plays a role. The closer you are to Russia, the more you feel directly threatened by what they do. But it also comes down to history and how much of a threat each country feels.
So countries like Poland and the Baltic states, with their history of, Russian domination, they see this as a potential existential threat, while others maybe see it as a more distant conflict.
Exactly. For some, this brings up memories of past occupations, of oppression, and this constant fear of Russian interference. They see what's happening in Ukraine, and they see parallels to their own historical struggles.
So for them, it's not just about geopolitics. It's about their very identity as nations.
Precisely. And that historical memory, it shapes their entire perspective on this whole conflict.
Okay, we've got a pretty good handle on how Europe's reacting. Now, I want to kind of zoom out a bit and think about the global implications of all of this. Because this can't just be about Europe, right?
Oh, you're absolutely right. This has the potential to reshape the entire global order. It could impact everything, from international relations to global economic trends, and that's something we'll definitely delve into in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've been talking about the shockwaves that this unexpected U.S. move has sent across Europe. But, sometimes it's easy to get lost in all the diplomatic back and forth.
Oh, absolutely.
And forget that at the heart of all this are real people.
Yeah.
Real people whose lives have been turned upside down.
It's true. The human cost of this war is immeasurable. You've got millions of people displaced, homes and cities in ruins, countless lives lost. And every single day that this conflict drags on, the suffering just gets worse and worse.
Yeah, that's a really important point. It's a stark reminder that this isn't just some kind of theoretical exercise, in international relations.
Right.
So with the U.S. now signaling this potential shift towards a negotiated settlement, what are we actually seeing? Like, what are some concrete signs that their approach to this war might be changing?
Well, there's been a shift. It's subtle, but it's noticeable in the language that's coming out of Washington. You're hearing less about Ukraine achieving a complete victory and more about finding a negotiated settlement, some kind of path to peace that involves compromises from both sides.
So moving away from that Ukraine must win at all costs narrative.
Exactly. And that's significant. It really suggests that their priorities might be changing. Maybe the U.S. is starting to put more emphasis on its own national interests, rather than just focusing solely on what Ukraine wants to achieve.
Yeah, I can see how that would make European leaders pretty nervous. I mean, they've been counting on the U.S. to have their back, and now it feels like the rug might be pulled out from under them.
That's exactly the kind of anxiety that you're seeing in a lot of European capitals right now. They know that the U.S. could disengage, and they'd be left to deal with a much more assertive Russia right on their doorstep.
Yeah.
And this fear is really acute in those countries that share a border with Russia, especially Poland and the Baltic states. They have that history of Russian aggression, so they're understandably worried.
I can see why they'd be thinking, okay, so if the U.S. backs down, who's going to have our backs?
That's the big question. And all this uncertainty has actually fueled a growing push for Europe to have more, strategic autonomy. The idea that they need to be able to defend themselves without always having to rely on the U.S.
So maybe a silver lining. This whole crisis might finally push Europe to get serious about their own defense capabilities.
It's possible this could be the push they needed to really work together on security and defense, something they've struggled with in the past. But actually achieving that autonomy, it won't be easy. You've got 27 countries in the EU, each with their own priorities, their own history, and let's not forget their own defense budgets. To actually build a unified, effective European defense force, well, that would require overcoming some pretty deep political and economic differences.
Yeah, that sounds like a monumental challenge. Trying to get 27 countries to agree on anything, let alone something as complex as defense policy, well, it's a tall order.
For sure. But you know what? This situation, as dire as it is, it just might provide that extra push, the impetus they need to finally overcome those obstacles. The stakes are high, and the threat is very, very real.
Okay, so let's say these U.S.-Russia talks do move forward. What are some of the key issues, the big sticking points that are likely to dominate those discussions?
Well, first and foremost, you have to talk about territorial integrity. Russia is currently occupying large portions of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, which they took back in 2014. And Ukraine, they've been very clear. They want all of their territory back. No compromises.
So no giving up land for peace.
Very unlikely. I mean, can you imagine any Ukrainian government agreeing to a deal that leaves Russian troops on their soil? Politically, it would be impossible. And I think there would be massive public opposition.
But on the flip side, Russia isn't just going to pack up and leave empty-handed.
Right. No, of course not.
They've invested a lot in this war. Militarily, politically, it's cost them a lot.
And that's the problem. It's a real dilemma. Because Russia, they're going to want something in return for any kind of withdrawal. So that sets the stage for what could be a very, very difficult negotiation. You've got both sides digging in their heels, holding firm on positions that seem completely irreconcilable.
Okay, so territorial integrity, that's a big one. What else is going to be a point of contention?
Security guarantees. That's another huge issue. Ukraine is going to want ironclad assurances that they won't be attacked again. They're going to be looking for some kind of security umbrella, a real credible deterrent to prevent Russia from doing this again.
And who would provide those guarantees? Would that be NATO?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? NATO membership for Ukraine, that's always been a red line for Russia. They see it as a direct threat, bringing Western military forces right up to their border. And I don't think the U.S. is willing to risk a direct conflict with Russia over this.
So Ukraine is in this really tough spot. They need security guarantees, but they can't get them from the very powers that could actually provoke them.
Yeah, it's a precarious position, to say the least. They're basically being asked to make concessions, maybe give up territory, or accept limitations on their future foreign policy, all without any real guarantee of their long-term security.
It sounds like these negotiations, if they even happen, are going to be incredibly complex and full of tension.
Oh, absolutely. The stakes are incredibly high. The outcome of these talks, if they do happen, will not only determine what happens to Ukraine, but they'll have huge implications for the future of Europe, for transatlantic relations, for the entire global order. It's a big deal.
Okay, so let's shift gears for a second and talk about the impact of this war on the global economy. I mean, we're already seeing energy prices going through the roof, supply chains disrupted, inflation soaring all over the world. How is this conflict changing the economic landscape, both for the average person and on a global scale?
Well, it's definitely accelerated a lot of trends that were already happening. For example, it's really exposed just how vulnerable we are when we rely on a single supplier for essential things like energy. You look at Europe and their dependence on Russian gas, it's really come back to bite them.
Yeah, no kidding. It's a hard lesson in the dangers of putting all your eggs in one basket.
It is. And this energy crisis that we're seeing, it's pushing a lot of countries to diversify their energy sources and to move away from fossil fuels, altogether.
So is this the start of a green energy revolution?
It could be. The war has been a huge boost to the renewable energy sector. As countries try to wean themselves off Russian oil and gas, they're turning to renewables. This could really speed up the transition to cleaner energy, which would be good for the environment and for global energy security in the long run.
Okay, so maybe some good could come out of this terrible situation. But what about global trade? There's been a lot of talk about decoupling and reshoring, basically countries and companies bringing production back home. Are those trends here to stay?
I think it's very likely. The war has highlighted the risks of these really complex global supply chains, especially for essential goods and technologies. Companies are starting to think differently. They're looking for ways to bring production closer to home so they're less vulnerable to disruptions that might happen halfway across the world.
So maybe we're moving away from this hyper-globalized world that we've gotten used to and shifting towards economies that are a bit more, regionalized.
It's a real possibility. And that could have a big impact on the global economy. It could lead to higher prices for consumers, less efficiency, and maybe even slower economic growth over time.
Wow, that's a lot of potential downsides. Are there any potential upsides to this economic shakeup?
Well, one potential benefit is greater resilience. By having more diverse supply chains and not being so reliant on just one supplier, countries and companies can make themselves less vulnerable to those big shocks and disruptions, whether they're political, economic, or even environmental.
So kind of like take a bit of a hit now for more stability in the future, a trade-off between efficiency and stability.
Yeah, that's one way to think about it. But it's important to remember that this shift, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take time, and it's going to require some big adjustments and a willingness to adapt to a whole new economic reality.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, from diplomatic fallout to the economic implications. It's a lot to process. But before we wrap up, I think we have to talk about another crucial aspect of this conflict, and that's its impact on the information landscape. I mean, this war has been called the first real social media war, hasn't it?
It has, and for good reason. The way we get information, the way we consume it, and the way it's manipulated, all of that has been fundamentally changed by social media and the internet. And this conflict, it's a perfect example of how things have changed.
So how has this war changed how we consume and understand information?
Well, we've seen this massive explosion of propaganda, disinformation, fake news, and it's coming from all sides. It's become this battle for hearts and minds just as much as a battle for territory.
Like this 24/7 information war that's being fought online, with all these different narratives battling it out for dominance.
Exactly. And the average person who's just trying to figure out what's going on, they're caught in the crossfire. It's gotten incredibly difficult to tell what's real and what's not. Social media, with its algorithms designed to keep you scrolling, well, they've become these echo chambers.
Right.
They reinforce your biases and make it really hard to have, a reasoned and informed debate about anything.
So how do we navigate this? How do we separate what's real from all the noise in this constant flood of information?
That's the big challenge, isn't it? We all need to become much more discerning consumers of information. We have to check our sources, verify the claims, and really be aware of our own biases. Just because something pops up on your feed or fits with your worldview doesn't mean it's true.
So media literacy is more important now than ever.
Absolutely. We've got to be able to think critically about the information that's coming at us. Be skeptical, especially of things that seem too good to be true, and actively seek out diverse perspectives. We can't just passively absorb everything that's thrown at us.
Yeah, it's like we need to develop some kind of information immune system.
I like that.
To protect ourselves from all the junk that's out there. But even when you are skeptical, it can feel overwhelming. There's just so much information.
I get that. It is a lot. But that's exactly why it's so important to talk about this stuff, to break down these complex issues and help people understand this crazy, rapidly changing world that we live in.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, haven't we?
We have.
I mean, we started by talking about the potential ramifications of these U.S.-Russia talks and how Europe is reacting.
Yeah.
Then we talked about the human cost of the war, which is just, heartbreaking.
It is.
And we even talked about how this whole conflict is reshaping the global economy, right? And even the way we consume information. It's been a lot.
It has been quite a journey. And, what strikes me is that this war in Ukraine, it's touched practically every corner of the world.
Yeah, it really has.
And the effects, those long-term consequences, they're still playing out.
Absolutely.
I think it's safe to say that the world's going to look very different when this conflict is finally over.
No kidding. Okay, so let's bring this back to our listeners for a minute. Why should all of this matter to them?
Yeah.
To someone who's just trying to, navigate this increasingly complex world, what's the big takeaway here?
Well, I think the most important thing to understand is that we're entering a period of intense uncertainty and instability. A lot of the old rules, the assumptions we used to have about international relations, about global security, they're being challenged.
Right.
We're seeing a shift in the global order, and we all need to be ready to adapt to this new reality.
So buckle up, everyone.
It's going to be a bumpy ride.
It is. But what can people do? Besides just bracing for impact, what can they do to stay informed and, engaged with all these complex issues?
Yeah.
Because it's easy to feel overwhelmed and just want to tune it all out.
Oh, I know. It's tempting. But honestly, that's the worst thing you can do. Staying informed, it's crucial, now more than ever.
Okay.
Read widely, seek out different perspectives, and be willing to question your own assumptions. Don't just stay in your own little echo chamber, surrounded by information that only reinforces what you already believe.
Right.
Go out there and grapple with different ideas, even the ones that make you feel uncomfortable. Challenge yourself.
Great advice. It's about being an active participant, right?
Yeah.
Not just passively absorbing whatever comes across your screen.
Exactly.
Anything else our listeners should keep in mind as they try to make sense of this new world, so to speak?
I think it's really important to remember that this isn't just some far-off conflict.
Yeah.
This war in Ukraine, it has global implications. It will affect all of us, whether it's through higher prices at the gas station, economic uncertainty, or even how disinformation spreads online. This conflict is going to touch our lives, and probably in ways we don't even realize yet.
So we can't afford to be bystanders.
Right.
We need to stay informed, stay engaged, and be ready to, adapt to whatever happens next.
Absolutely. And that brings me to a final thought, a question for you to consider.
Okay.
With the U.S. signaling this potential shift in its approach to the war, will Europe take this opportunity to become more independent, to really take charge of its own security?
That's a really interesting question.
It is, isn't it?
Will Europe step up and fill the void? Or will they continue to rely on the U.S. for their security? The answer to that question, it has huge implications, not just for Europe, but for transatlantic relations and the global balance of power.
It really does. And the decisions that are made in the coming months and years, they're going to shape the world for decades to come.
Well, that about wraps it up for this deep dive. We've explored a lot. The potential consequences of this unexpected move by the U.S., the diplomatic fallout, the human cost, the impact on the global economy, and even how this conflict is changing how we consume information. It's a complicated situation, and it's constantly evolving. Hopefully this deep dive has given you some insights and maybe even some more questions to think about. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back soon to explore another corner of this amazing, ever-changing world. Until then, stay curious.